Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis here, and this week's lesson is on America in the early Cold War, particularly 1950s America. So, around the turn of the decade, around about 1950, the Cold War very much intensified. So if the period from the end of World War II in 1945 to 1947 was a period where perhaps the Cold War could have gone one way or the other, the period from 1948 to 1950 was a period in which the Cold War very distinctly escalated. We had incidents like the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift, in which Stalin tried to blockade the city of Berlin, located in the heart of East Germany, from access by the Allies, to try to push the Allies out of Berlin and thereby make Berlin fully a part of Eastern Germany. Of course, that fails in the subsequent Berlin airlift, and the blockade is broken, and East and West Berlin remain divided, of course, until 1989. It will be Nikita Khrushchev, about a decade later, who will begin the construction of the Berlin Wall. In 1947, the National Security Act in the United States really created the modern structure of the U.S. national security apparatus. The National Security Act of 1947 created the Defense Department, the Pentagon. It created the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. It also created the National Security Council to advise the president on matters of foreign policy. And this act was a product of the fact that the United States in the Cold War was now assuming a more involved foreign policy than had ever been the case in the United States' history. The United States had truly become a global superpower, and the demands of containing communism globally necessitated a creation of really the modern national security state. And as you know at the bottom, ultimately with what's called the military-industrial complex, which is a term that references the interconnection of private sector contracts, private sector businesses and jobs, politicians, the Pentagon, and the federal government right up to the executive branch. It is the web of influence between the private sector and the defense sector in the government, and also associated with that the broader political connections. And this was something that President Eisenhower, of course, in his farewell address, warned Americans about, because he saw this as the military-industrial complex, because of the new demands of national security and because of the new demands of global containment policy. Eisenhower said that we needed to be on guard from expanded influence, whether sought or not, by the military-industrial complex in the government of the United States. So it was a potential threat to certain aspects of our democratic process. We have the formation of NATO in 1949, and later, by 1955, you have the formation of the Warsaw Pact. NATO was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was designed to provide a unified sort of alliance system to oppose the Cold War, the communist bloc, which in the mid-1950s, pretty sure it was 55, the Soviet Union would respond with the creation of the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was basically like NATO, except it was Russia in its Eastern European satellites that were then standing in aligned opposition to NATO. In China, the communist forces under Mao Zedong successfully come to power in 1949, running the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek off of mainland China to the island of Taiwan. Until the mid-1970s, the United States recognized Taiwan as the government of China. And then, of course, since the economic explosion in China with Deng Xiaoping and the recognition of Maoist Chinese government in the 1970s, the Chinese have continued to contend that Taiwan is a place in rebellion that needed to be brought back into this sphere of Chinese influence, and the United States has quietly disagreed with that. And of course, today there's still tensions over Taiwan between the United States and China. In 1949, the Soviets detonate the first atomic bomb, and at this point, we really begin to see the atomic weapon become something that really ingrains a certain fear into Americans in the United States, the fear of the atomic bomb, and associated with it also the fear of espionage, because with the development of the Soviet atomic bomb came allegations of espionage in the United States from the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel, to Alger Hiss, to other scientists who were in some cases involved, at least alleged, in some cases pretty clearly, in espionage. With respect to atomic secrets. So there was increasing fear in the United States of the Soviet atomic bomb, the dropping of the atomic bomb, and also that there could be spies everywhere in the country. And that fear of espionage is something that really created tension in society and had a great deal of impact on society, as we'll talk about in just a moment. In 1950, you see the emergence of a new kind of containment policy, and this comes with the National Security document NSC 68. NSC 68 was a security document signed by the Truman administration, and what it basically did is it globalized the containment policy. So before, containment policy was largely localized to Europe, for George Kennan to key strong points, but even after the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, the containment policy was largely a concern with Soviet expansion in Europe. With the development of NSC 68 and the subsequent development of the Korean War in 1950, and then of course the escalation of the Vietnam situation, the French Indochina War is going on in Vietnam at this time, as well as with the Chinese Maoist revolution, there's increasing concerns that now the United States really needed to contain communism across the globe. Wherever communism was pushing and developing, the United States increasingly accepted that it needed a foreign policy that could contain communism no matter where it was advancing. And this is really the globalization of containment and the idea that containing communism in the developing world, containing communism in a place like Vietnam, was as significant as and important as containing communism had it been pushing into West Germany. NSC 68, as a result, necessitated a huge military buildup. Military budgets in the 1950s went through the roof because of the requirements of maintaining a large peacetime standing army and the requirements of an arms race to advance the highest technologies capable of fulfilling the plan of global containment. This was global symmetrical containment, meaning that any part of the globe where communism was pushing was effectively seen as equally a threat to the American sphere of influence in the globe. And of course, with this is where you see really the real development of the domino theory in foreign policy. The Korean War, of course, starts shortly after NSC 68 comes out. NSC 68 and the Korean War sort of justified each other. Here you had, Korean communists from the north invading the south at the behest of the communist world. Of course, we have the first hydrogen bomb in 1952. Thermonuclear bombs become a reality by the mid-1950s, and these weapons were, in some cases, as powerful as 1,000 times the power of the atomic bomb. And of course, with Sputnik, by 1957, Sputnik, for a lot of people, meant more than just the exploration of space, and this image you see here is the Soviet satellite Sputnik in 1957. But Sputnik meant that now the Soviets didn't need to fly a bomber over the United States to drop a potential thermonuclear weapon. They could theoretically put it on a rocket and shoot it at you. And it really enhanced the concern and fear in the United States over potentially World War III, and increasingly maybe even a thermonuclear World War III. just to reiterate what was just mentioned on the last slide, the Cold War had tremendous influence on domestic society in the 1950s, bringing together the sort of contradiction in the 1950s of a conformist culture where traditional norms of gender, race, and class are sort of reified. Traditional family norms are sort of reified and become guideposts for people's behavior in society, while sort of contradicting the idea of individual freedom in some respects. And you'll see in the 1960s this sort of contradiction of American society in the 50s and 60s is sort of pulled apart by some members of society as, in one respect, society increasingly sought conformity. In other respects, the affluence had by American society in the 50s and 60s sort of demanded a new level of individual freedom and individual pursuit. Of course, you see here, pictured here, you see, of course, the Cleavers from Leave It to Beaver, a famous sitcom from the era, and it kind of conveys the sort of the look at the sort of traditional American family, the traditional sort of nuclear family. Elaine Taylor May has written the book Homeward Bound, and she talks about the 50s, the era in which we see bomb shelters and prepping as a normality for American societies, as a sort of domestic containment where society sort of returned to more traditional values of family, of sexuality, of gender norms in society, out of a way of dealing with these sort of uncertainties of the international world and of the threat and the fear of nuclear war. You also, of course, in the 50s, see the beginning of a pushback by the status quo on organized labor, as well as as increasingly the United States begins to see the government side more and more with corporate influences over labor influences. It was not a clean break, but it was a long progressive change in which we see that occur. And evidence of that, too, of course, is the fact that 5 of the first 6 secretaries of defense following World War I were actually former CEOs of the American auto manufacturers. The most notable, of course, being Robert McNamara, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of Defense, who was the CEO from Ford Motor Company. Civil liberties really took a hit during the 1950s, during what's called the Red Scare, the fear over espionage, the Rosenbergs, Alger Hiss, these types of things really created a heightened concern in the country. And of course, there were the House Un-American Activities hearings. There were the similar hearings in the Senate, led by the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy. And these created a heightened fear in the country over communist espionage, and further encouraged people to return to sort of more of a traditional norms of gender, family, and sexuality as a way of sort of insulating themselves from the threat of communism. And oftentimes, those who fell outside the bounds of sort of traditional norms were often identified as potentially communist. During the Eisenhower administration in the 50s, it was completely known that the Eisenhower administration would fire an individual for suspicion of homosexuality, because it was believed that homosexuality was deviant sexual behavior, and thereby it was more likely to be the individual was more likely to be under the influence or potentially influenced by communist subversives. Of course, as I mentioned the last slide as well, economics, politics, and society. You see, too, the emergence of the military-industrial complex, an explosion of technology, which undoubtedly was connected to the emergence of the UFO craze, which in the 1950s, really, the UFO craze really reaches its height. Following the late 40s incident at Roswell, there were a series of UFO incidents and sightings, some of which were actually reported by the government and still remain unexplained. But undoubtedly, these incidents are not aliens from another planet, but are almost undoubtedly somehow relevant to the robust technological and scientific development that's going on at the height of the Cold War, the height of our investment into high-tech aerospace technology. And of course, the entire era, too, was associated with the creation of a climate of fear through propaganda, concern over communism, and communism around every corner, which encouraged support for the government's new robust national security objectives. So the escalation of the Cold War, coupled with material affluence, changed American culture in the 1940s and 50s. And the reason it did this was a couple of ways. First, maybe most obvious, fear. Fear in society over the atomic bomb leads to the construction of bomb shelters, food stockpiles, paranoia of communists at home in World War III. Consequences of that, as I mentioned last slide, are, the nuclear family, the idea of domestic containment, which is a very, that's a very somewhat nebulous subject to discuss. And I encourage you to look at Homeward Bound, listed at the bottom of your screen, if you're interested in exploring this more. But in the 50s, we see American society really reified around traditional values of family, of sexuality, and so forth. And so as a result of that, in the 1950s, women married, and they married young, and they were encouraged to be homemakers. And of course, this sort of traditional, if you will, American society is the backbone behind what leads to the cultural revolutions in sexuality, with respect to family, with respect to race, gender as well, in the 1960s. So gender norms are reified. You have increasingly social conservative life in America. There's entrenched anti-gay perspectives that are promoted in the 1950s as a way of kind of navigating this world that centers around the fear of atheistic communism destroying American culture. We also see a turn to religion in the 1950s, as many defined the Cold War as a crusade of Christian society against atheistic empire. And some of the evidence of this, of course, are things like the addition of the Pledge of Allegiance to the dollar. In God We Trust to the dollar, and the addition of Under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, which all are added in the 1950s, and are evidence of the fact that the United States is very much reifying its culture against this new sort of global communist threat. Of course, as a result of the fear of espionage at home, we see real setbacks for American civil liberties and personal freedoms. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, conducted a myriad of illegal investigation. They created lists and portfolios of individuals that they could potentially smear. They organized break-ins of things like the National Lawyers Guild. Hoover ordered the FBI to break in 14 times to the National Lawyers Guild, because the National Lawyers Guild tended to defend the individuals that were being charged of potential, communist sympathizing and or espionage. There were thousands of government employees fired, and Hoover had his own motivations sometimes of who should be targeted, who should be surveilled, and who should be let go. And a lot of times the people that were charged or released weren't even told to charge. You also have, of course, the tactics of Joe McCarthy, who used half-truth and circumstantial evidence in the Senate, which terribly damaged careers and ruined reputations. These types of developments were all inherently linked to the Truman administration's insistence, really, on using an exaggerated fear tactic to mobilize support for containment. once the Truman administration with the Truman Doctrine kind of got the sort of fear of communists around every corner and global containment and the domino theory out of the bag, it was difficult for them to control how an individual like Joseph McCarthy, or in the House of Representatives, an individual like Richard Nixon, who was also kind of just a little bit less intense than Joseph McCarthy in carrying out witch hunts on suspected communist or communist sympathizers. And you see here an example of a headline from the period of the firing of professors at Washington University. The 50s is also associated with a technological explosion and, as a result, a lifestyle change driven by a new level of affluence. As they've also already mentioned, this new technological explosion is certainly also attributed to the rise in the UFO craze, and this is undoubtedly linked to U.S. developments of the U-2 spy plane program, and then later programs that built things like the SR-71 Blackbird, high-altitude balloon programs, as well as other types of tests. You see pictured in the drawing here, Chuck Yeager, who famously broke the sound barrier in 1947 for the first time. You have the emergence in the 50s of plastics, of the transistor, and the development of computers, which at the time were as big as a room. A powerful IBM computer took up like a whole floor of a building. But today, of course, that technology, based largely on many of these technological changes, is incredibly advanced. Microwave technology, and associated with it, the TV dinner. And frozen foods that can be put in your microwave very easy. All kinds of new gadgets in the kitchen and the house. Suburban sprawl, mass housing, of course, is a new product of the affluence of the 50s, and the kind of idea that in the 1950s the American dream was to have one or two cars in a small little house in the suburbs, and you'd commute daily into your work, and the wife would stay at home and she would care for the house. During the 1950s, there's social migrations going on too, or demographic migrations, I should say, demographic changes. There's the rise of the so-called Sun Belt. Places like Florida, Texas, Arizona, and of course also Southern California, where many of the major industries associated with the new sort of military-industrial complex and the new aerospace programs we're all moving to, with, of course, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, of course, Houston, Texas as a center for not only the petroleum industry, but also for the space program as well. And, of course, Pasadena, where the Jet Propulsion Lab, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, was located. So many of the nice weathered states, if you will, the warmer South states from Southern California to Texas to Florida, even Alabama, which of course Huntsville, Alabama, was where the Apollo space program was centered. There is a swell, even though I'm not sure we would consider Huntsville part of the Sun Belt per se, but there was a swell of new jobs and demographic migrations and shifts to those jobs that were oftentimes connected to the defense industries or the aerospace industries. And this led to what we might call the rise of the Sun Belt. So increasingly in the 50s, you see the so-called white flight as white folks move away from the heart of the city out to the suburbs which are usually racially segregated. We see urban areas increasingly populated by African American communities who are looking for jobs in these places. We see an emergence of increasing shift of American populations to areas of the Sun Belt where there are new jobs and new opportunities and new lifestyles to be had to fulfill this new affluent American dream. And of course, the automobile industry in a lot of respects, really becomes a defining characteristic of these new communities. Suburbia was really a thing that was made possible because of the car. Suburbia wasn't connected by trains. It was highways and, of course, the interstate system, which will begun to be built in the late 1950s, begun by the Eisenhower administration. The interstates, highways, road systems are developed, and the automobile is really the vehicle that defines a person's freedom in the 50s, from your ability to live out in the suburbs and to drive a car, and for that mobility to give you freedom to drive across the country, to go watch a movie in your car, to have your first sexual intimacies in the backseat of a car, to go to McDonald's and to be served right out of your car. These were really very defining features of American society in the 1950s. And of course, in the backseat of the car, sexual intimacy was something that was actively sort of repressed by society, by the sort of parenting generation of society who sought to use curfews and all kinds of procedures, dating rooms, for example, to prevent boy and girl from, having too many encounters all alone. But the car became a place where young people were able to pursue intimacy and these encounters on their own. And in the 50s, it was very repressed. In the 60s, there is kind of an explosion of this distinction between public and private. There is a breaking down of the idea that sexuality should be repressed in this way. And that's why the 1960s becomes associated with being a sexual revolution. But as scholars like Beth Bailey have pointed out, it's really only a revolution to the people that experienced it. Because the reality is that people were already doing the things that are associated with the sexual revolution of the 60s. It was just repressed and hidden from public eye. But the 1960s changed that and suddenly tore down the kind of barrier between public and private that was so significant during the 1950s. And as a result of that, the people that experienced that often felt that it was a revolution. Here you see an example of Levittown, Long Island, one of the suburbs that was created following the housing shortage following World War II, and these were all prefab houses that were all constructed. They all look exactly the same, and of course, the Levittown was also segregated, and it became a town of tens of thousands of people, and it was all entirely segregated. It was an all-white community. Suburbia symbolized freedom and conformity. It symbolized a never-before affluence for the American dream to be everyone to own their own home, basically, to own the amount of cars, to have the kind of roads that make it all possible. By the end of the 50s, there's 50 million families and there's 60 million cars in the country. Incredible affluence. Suburbia also, symbolizes conformity. All the houses are the same in many of these standard suburban towns. And what happens in the house is oftentimes from society constructed as though it should be the same, though it might not be. And so there's this contradiction of freedom and conformity, and you see it embodied in the suburban American dream. There's televisions now in every home, too. And these televisions help create the first truly national identity as people begin watching commercials and television shows that are the same as the same commercials that people watch all over the country. You see here, of course, McDonald's and the 1950s cars. The 50s births not only fast food, but processed foods in general. Atomic testing, of course, too, was commonplace in the 40s and 50s. And here you can see a mushroom cloud, a distant mushroom cloud looming like a normal cloud in the background of Las Vegas. And while the testing in Las Vegas, the tests were, Las Vegas wasn't downwind from the tests. There were cases in the 50s where tests, wind currents changed and tests had effects on local communities. Here, of course, you see another open viewing of an open-air atomic test. In the 50s and 40s and early 50s, and we really didn't fully understand the threat of radiation. But by 1963, increasingly I realized how bad this was for the environment, and because there was upwards of 500 open-air atomic and nuclear tests between this period, and as a result, the United States under John F. Kennedy, along with the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev, would famously sign the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty, thereby banning open-air tests of atomic and nuclear weapons. And the tests went underground, but that was seen as much better alternative than all of the open-air tests that were done in, for example, the Nevada desert, as you see here. Of course, and also many were done out in the Pacific at places like Bikini Atoll.